So at the end of May here in a couple of weeks, being 2 years since I started doing wrestling videos on this channel, I haven't really gotten a chance before to talk a little more off the cuff about my experiences doing all this, really. I've done my best to do scripted videos, and I'm sure by now I would talk to you about what the setup would be for whatever topic I'm talking about regularly. But today I wanted to do something just kind of a way to celebrate the occasion, but also as a way to thank you guys for how far this channel's gone. Wanted to do a nice little Q&A video. I didn't really know how many people would be interested in it, but I'm glad that some of you guys were. So just to quickly get the intro out of the way, I got a few different comments or questions you guys left in relation to all this, and I wanted to answer them as best as I can, although I cannot promise that I'm probably going to be rambling a little bit, since this is one of those few times I'm doing it completely unscripted. I don't have any notes or anything. I'm just going to go off of what I have in questions and just kind of hope for the best. But hopefully I'll still be able to answer your guys' questions or replying to comments as best as possible. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive right into the first question. How did you start watching wrestling, and what caught your attention to make you a fan? I want to say at least from like '07 to '08 was when I got introduced to WWE. The first real exposure I got to it was back then when I would spend the weekend at my dad's. I think every other week we got to go down to Blockbuster towards the tail end of it being in business. They would have some of the pay-per-views from '07 on DVD, and I got to rent one of those and watch them here and there. I remember Vengeance Night of Champions was one I prominently watched. Backlash, I think, was in the mix as well. I can't remember if Mania 23 was also in there. It might have been, or I might have mixed it up with another show from that period. But I started watching some of the pay-per-views, so I started getting more familiar with guys like Cena and Orton and Punk off the bat through watching those shows. And the other thing that kind of helped me introduce, at the time, more of the current product was playing SmackDown vs. Raw '09 on the PS2. And that helped me be more up to date with WWE, and also kickstarted my interest in wrestling games. Because not only was SVR9 in the mix, I actually remember Showdown Legends of Wrestling was another one that I would rent every now and then. It's not the best game to be familiar with when it came to older wrestling from the territories and all that. But I kind of have a soft spot in my heart for it, because I thought for what it was a pretty cool experience. And again, it helped me introduce to some of wrestling outside of the WWE bubble. And then around '09 was when I was starting to watch more prominently, with SmackDown being on My Network TV at the time. Either I would be able to watch it on Friday nights when it was airing initially, or the day after. I think it was on the local Fox affiliate. They would air a replay of SmackDown from like 12 or 1 o'clock, because usually in the early afternoon is when all the live sports games and the coverage of it would start on the other affiliate channels. So that was when I would start to watch more of WWE frequently, and then over time got to watch a little bit more of Raw whenever it was not too hectic of a school night. And then I think the first pay-per-views for me were Mania 26 and 27. What ended up catching my attention as a fan just were how some of the guys were, and forgive me, this is probably cliche, but they were presented as larger-than-life heroes, and just how chaotic but also fun watching it could be, which is kind of ironic given that this was almost peak PG era, which is not particularly great in some ways. But back then, I'm young enough to where I didn't really care too much. I was enjoying a lot of what was going on, for better or worse. But the guys in particular that stood out to me was a big Cena fan, because if you were a kid growing up during that time, I don't really know how you couldn't have been in some way. I started becoming more a fan of Randy Orton over time. Rey Mysterio was always a guy that I thought looked cool because of the different masks and the colored attires that he had and everything. And then I remember around Money in the Bank 2011, that was another show I got to watch live. I remember when Daniel Bryan won Money in the Bank, I was starting to become a little more fond of him, and especially more of CM Punk, watching him leave through the crowd with the WWE title. And around that time was also when I was starting to get more familiar with indie wrestling in small doses, TNA was a product that I started watching more like a year or so after, when the Aces and Eights storyline was going on. That one I would have DVR'd and recorded every week, so I would kind of catch up with it on the weekends. And then eventually just getting more exposure through wrestling YouTube channels and understanding more about what indie wrestling was in general. What really got me into wrestling was just the variety of it. Even if there were things in WWE or TNA that wouldn't have appealed to me, there's a whole scope of independent promotions that can be either serious or more down to earth, or a lot more comedic or over the top. And on top of being able to go back and watch, the territories or old school WWF, maybe even ECW, and especially for me, the Nitro era of WCW, even if it's some of the more obscure or I guess more hidden gem level of matches or rivalries that are out there, there's always something about wrestling that you'll appreciate, and there's always something that can appeal to you, even if others may not agree or may not see it through your lens. It's a wide variety show. That's what I've enjoyed most about my time being a wrestling fan. Do you keep up with current wrestling products? If so, who are your favorite performers? I do. I still keep up with WWE pretty actively. Easily at the top of my head, I would say that Gunther or Braun Breaker and Jacob Fatu, those are the names at the top of my head I mentioned that are really enjoyable to watch in the ring. And in the case of Gunther and Fatu, some of their character work is especially stellar. And I'm also glad that guys like Braun and Fatu are starting to get a little prominently pushed in the company, with Braun now in this faction with Seth and Paul, and then Fatu getting the US title. I honestly just kind of hope these guys, especially with Braun, get pushed more into the world title scene within the next year or two, because the way they've been presented and been booked, really they could be very credible enough challengers to kind of slide into the title picture, and frankly, I personally wouldn't have an issue with that. I still enjoy watching CM Punk since he's come back, and with Cena's current heel run with the world title, I'm very curious, because right now I'm recording this before Backlash, so I'm waiting to see how things turn out with him and Randy. But just seeing the idea of exploring some of his greater rivalries over the past number of years, with the dynamic being switched, and seeing all this material with his promos and everything, that's got me very curious as to where the whole retirement tour is going to go by the end of this year. I do kind of keep up with AEW, but not as frequently as I used to. There's just particular moments or storylines that I really was not a fan of, and still am not a big fan of. But even with that, I'll say that the Adam Page has been enjoyable to watch. I kind of came around a little later to Timeless Toni Storm. I frankly love how dedicated she is to doing that character. And really a lot of the established names that have been brought over, like the Hurt Syndicate and MJF stuff, or even Ricochet and some of the heel work he's been doing, those are the things I'll keep up with as well. I will also end AEW with saying that a lot less said about the Death Riders right now is for the best. And beyond that, when it comes to TNA, to New Japan, some of the different promotions, I just try and check out any clips that pop up on social media. Also kind of get familiar with what's going on through different people that I follow, or some different reviews that are out there. But generally speaking, I still keep up, at the very least, with WWE, some of AEW, and a little bit of others, depending on what's out there. What's your ideal C-show? I'd have to say worldwide, because it seemed like the Wild West of wrestling rosters for the last few years of WCW's existence. And I kind of agree with that sentiment. I know there's some weird contention about where some of these lower tier weekend shows from major promotions could be considered, if they're C show, if they're D show, or if maybe they're somewhat high enough to be a B show of sorts. But to try and be fair and objective about my answer here, my ideal C show really is more of like an hour of wrestling that for the most part is pretty hands off when it comes to management or the bookers. Where they'll throw some undercard talent out there, maybe they'll be able to get a local name that at first is just there for a one-off, but then ends up becoming a little more prominent in the business down the road. And they'll just kind of let the talent go out there and just do whatever. When it comes to getting finishes or doing particular interviews or angles or what have you, since their focus is more on the main weekly shows where all the major stars and the bigger storylines and all that are playing out. The best example I can kind of give would be Steven Richards when he was talking with Rene Dupree on his podcast about the whole Stevie Knight Heat angle. How he mentioned that there were supposed to be matches already booked in advance, how they would go to the production team and they would actually shoot their own angles and interviews or anything to set up a completely different match or a completely different setup for what this whole Stevie Knight Heat thing was going to end up being. That's kind of my example as to what a C-show could be, is that incidentally you leave these guys, whether it be in ring work, and they end up having a really gem-worthy match or some stuff that starts to get people to notice them a little bit, or if it's just angles and storylines going on that are completely isolated from the main stuff that the bookers are doing, and it ends up creating this more underground, best kept secret type of show, where at first most people wouldn't really pay attention to it because it doesn't have the prominent stars, it's there to fill out time, and it's not of higher priority. But then later on you kind of hear, oh man, like there's this hidden gem-worthy match that happened, or there's this particular storyline that's going on that is really entertaining, and I feel like most people are really missing out on. That's really my ideal C-show for the most part, is giving a platform to talent that aren't really being mixed in with more of the main roster, and they're getting a chance to do something to get themselves TV time, or they're going out to the ring and proving that they still have value, they still have worth, and they want to get your attention to prove that they deserve to be given more opportunities than they already have. How far of a rabbit hole would you be willing to dive for a battle of the C-shows? My gut feeling is late 99 worldwide versus Jacked and Metal. Truth be told, I hadn't really even considered that idea of doing the format for some of these other shows. I always considered doing proper dedicated videos going into detail for each show specifically, worldwide being a great one, and especially Jacked and Metal, because I did kind of talk about it. I think a few months in when I did the wrestling stuff, I put together a whole video about the WWF's more obscure weekend programming. Jacked and Metal was in there, Livewire, and a few other ones. I kind of glossed over it, and I do feel like there's a lot more that could be talked about it and a few other shows that were in that video. But as far as doing like a very battle, like head-to-head type of video for Worldwide and Jacked and Metal, I wouldn't be against it, just to kind of see even more of a difference compared to Heat and Velocity, where Worldwide and Jacked are two completely different style shows with different presentation and all that. I wouldn't be against exploring the idea of it a little more, but for me personally first, I think I would want to do like proper, retrospective videos looking back specifically on Worldwide and Jacked and Metal, just to get a better idea as to what they were like individually, before I would consider putting them in a head-to-head format of sorts. Have you considered doing Battle of the Beast Show specials covering stuff like Stevie Knight Heat, Raven's abandoned 7 Deadly Sins storyline, or Paul London and Akio's feud, or his '05 Paul Losity run with the Cruiserweight title? Funnily enough, I did kind of sort of do that already when it came to doing the Beast Show retrospective videos for both Heat and Velocity. I've talked about Stevie Knight Heat stuff, the Raven 7 Deadly Sins stuff, and the Paul London Akio feud. But as far as doing like individual videos about them specifically, my initial thought was admittedly just to do compilation videos, where depending on when week to week I would be able to cover them in greater detail, I would just kind of splice out the matches or segments in relation to them and put it out as a whole story of type video that would go into greater detail as to what these storylines were all about. So I'm not against doing like videos specific on them. I just haven't really made a decision yet on whether I want to do that or just stick to the compilation videos. That's something I'm still waiting to figure out as I get closer and closer to actively covering them every week for Battle of the Beast shows. What was it like uploading the first few videos and your personal reactions to how they were received? I didn't really know if it was going to be received that much to begin with, to be perfectly honest with you. When I was doing the WCW Classics video, because that's the one I can kind of pinpoint to the earlier uploads that I was doing, I was just kind of doing that in part because I was still experimenting at the time with what type of content I wanted to do. I tried out with different styles of video with a little bit different editing and all that, but nothing really fit what I was trying to go for, or just didn't really sit well with me. So, on top of watching different YouTube wrestling channels and getting an idea as to how to present certain topics, I was more so surprised that it just wasn't covered at all. So I feel like it would be somewhat prominent since it was technically the last piece of WCW content after the buyout. So putting that video together, it was me just kind of learning how the whole process went and learning about some of the trials and error when it came to finding information about more obscure type of wrestling media. And I kind of understood why not everybody talks about stuff like this, since it obviously may not gain the same traction that more current or more popular topics would probably do. So when I did upload the video, to be honest, I was really thinking, oh, maybe like a couple hundred people will think that it's pretty cool, that they heard about it before or whatever. So I was genuinely surprised when that video ended up gaining a good amount of traction, and a lot of people left different comments talking about the show. And I remember there were a few, I think I went back not too long ago to check it out, that there were comments left behind by people who said that they were WCW fans and they didn't even know that the classics existed, or there were some memories about watching this show at the time, or just bringing back memories of, the old Crockett Promotions or Mid-Atlantic era wrestling in WCW. But that was also just as crucial for me, because now I could finally nail down an idea and a direction for what I wanted this channel to end up being, was being able to talk about wrestling, since I was well familiar with that by this point, a whole lot of media or some content in relation to WCW or the WWF, or just wrestling in general, that feels like for whatever reason or another has been glossed over, hasn't really been covered in greater detail, maybe just be completely forgotten, since it may not do as well as covering, certain aspects of the major promotions or just talking about the current products as a whole. So I'm glad I've got to use this channel as a bit of a platform to hopefully at least bring some awareness to these relatively obscure and more hidden gem worthy things that some people do remember fondly, and that the majority may not even know of or may not entirely remember. And that's really been the most rewarding thing for doing wrestling videos over the past 2 years, is that I've gotten to cover these things in some way, and always getting comments saying, hey, I remember watching these shows, or I remember watching this when it happened, or getting comments from those that didn't even know it existed to begin with. And seeing everybody's different perspectives or experiences with whatever it is I'm talking about, it is one of the cooler aspects of putting new videos out there for you guys every time I get the chance to. Of course, it's not been perfect. I've had plenty of mistakes, some more subtle, some more obvious, and maybe one or two particular mistakes that I'm never going to live down, no matter how much I really, really want to. But even with those errors and mistakes and maybe some flaws in all the videos that I've done, I'm very grateful for the fact that you guys have stuck around no matter when you popped in and started watching all this, and that you've taken time out of your day to watch this random dude online cover some piece of content or some show that very few people really care enough to look back on, and that it really means that much to you guys in some way. So now I can finally wrap this up, because I feel like I've been rambling forever, and I think it's pretty evident by now why I really need a script, because I'm not too great with trying to do ad-lib stuff, but at the very least wanted to do something a little different. Thank you all sincerely for sticking around for 2 years, for watching whatever video I put out, for showing you guys really like this and you want to see more of it, and frankly for getting this channel even further than I could have ever imagined. And I will hope that this is just the start of being able to cover even more within the wide, ridiculous scope of professional wrestling content. And I hopefully you guys will be along with me for wherever I take this moving forward. So thank you all again. I feel like I haven't said that enough, to be frank. But we will be getting back into the normal routine. We'll be getting back to the next Battle of the Beast shows in the very near future. So until then, be safe and take care.